Welcome to the latest event in our series, A Broader History of Thought, where we explore thought traditions from outside of the European influence on their own terms. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today. Professor Parimal Patil is professor of religion and Indian philosophy at Harvard University, where he's been teaching since receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2002. His primary interests are in the history of philosophy in India. Although his philosophical interests are quite broad, he is focused on Buddhist philosophy in India, the Old and New Epistemologists, and Indian traditions of physicalism and skepticism. He also has longstanding interests in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of religion and is author of Against a Hindu God and Buddhist philosophy of language in India. Please welcome Professor Parimal Patil.
Thank you all so much. I wanted to thank the Humanities Institute for inviting me to spend part of my evening and your afternoon with you, and also to thank all of you for spending so much time thinking about philosophers in classical India as a part of this lecture series. I should also say that it's really wonderful to see what the Humanities Institute has chosen to do this year with its lecture series on a broader history of thought. You know, the smartest people in the history of our world didn't just write in Latin and Greek and French and German and English and Spanish. Some of them wrote in Sanskrit and Chinese and Arabic, and some didn't write at all. Some just spoke and had oral traditions. And we in the modern university have really not done nearly as good a job as we should in trying to figure out how to learn from these thinkers who are perhaps from slightly different times and places than our inheritances have given us. So I'm really honored and proud to be part of the series and very much appreciate the leadership that the Humanities Institute is showing in sponsoring this series in this way. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend probably 40 to 50 minutes talking and reading a paper. And I'll stop in the middle and sometimes explain things or editorialize a bit. There's a series of slides that you will see. And so as I read, I'll say, you know, slide 1 is just the title, so that doesn't count. That's slide 0 really, but there'll be slide 1, slide 2, and I'm not controlling the slides, so I'm going to say it to make sure that the person who is controlling the slides flashes the slide at the appropriate time. So thank you for whoever's doing that. So we can put the title slide up if you'd like to start. All right, the title's slightly different than the one on the handout. I forgot that I changed it. And as all of you know, I'm going to be talking about the new epistemologists, and in particular, a philosopher named Gangesha, who some of you read a little bit about. So Gangesha's 14th century wish-fulfilling jewel for reality is arguably the most influential Sanskrit philosophical text of the second millennium. In many ways, it was a philosopher's stone for Sanskrit intellectuals, as an astonishing variety of writers throughout history turned to it, and the discussions it generated to test, refine, and in some cases, transform their views on the sources of knowledge and the diverse philosophical issues that were discussed in terms of them. It's fair to say that there was not a single Sanskrit knowledge system that was not influenced in its language, methodology, and understanding of philosophical problems and solutions by Gangesha's jewel. Its significance to the history of Sanskrit philosophy is thus difficult to overestimate. It was Gangesha's jewel that set the philosophical agenda, both methodologically and substantively, well into the 20th century, though exactly why this is the case is not yet known. It is very sad, therefore, that no one seems to really care about Gangesha or the new epistemologists anymore. The highly technical and seemingly impenetrable language in which they express themselves has led far too many to conclude that their work is intellectually idle, revealing of little more than disengaged scholasticism and irrelevant to the questions that motivate our own philosophical work today. After all, they reason, what else can explain the new epistemologists' transformation of even simple verbalized thoughts, such as Dasharatha is Rama's father, into monstrosities such as Dasharatha is the one who possesses the property being a father that is described by the property being a son that is located in Rama. When it is pointed out that if the language of the new epistemologists is intellectually idle, so too is the work of nearly every Sanskrit philosopher of the last 650 years, the chorus sings, so much the worse for them. Just to give you an idea of what that monstrosity sounds like, if we were to take the simple sentence, right, Dasharatha is Rama's father, and put it into Sanskrit, we would say, Ramasya pita Dasharataha, right? Ramasya pita Dasharataha. The new epistemologists think that's very imprecise. So they transform Ramasya pita Dasharataha into Ramanishta putratva nirupita pitratavan Dasharataha. Ramanishta putratva nirupita pitratavan Dasharataha. Because they think that saying Dasharatha is Rama's father is imprecise, so you need to specify things. So they say Dasharatha is the person who possesses a property. Which property? The property of being a father. Because in this context, his being a father is what's important, not his being 6 feet tall or whatever, right? So Dasharatha is the one who possesses a property being a father. Which property? Not the property being a father that Parimal has, but the property of being a father that is described by a property of there being a son, but not the property of being a son that belongs in my son. It's the property of being a son that is located in Rama. So you can see that this kind of language is off-putting to many. And what many have decided is that the work of the new epistemologists is just a kind of show-off. It's a kind of idle scholasticism. And if they talk this way about things like Rama's father, Dasharatha, you can only imagine how complicated it gets when we talk about technical issues in epistemology and metaphysics. So most people say the fact of this language gives us license to kind of just move on to something more interesting, right? So while understandable, these views are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the new epistemologists were up to, the aspiration of their new technical language, and their insights into what was necessary to resolve seemingly intractable philosophical problems. Simply put, the basic insight of the new epistemologists was that to properly pursue philosophical problems, one has to understand the complex and hidden structure of our thoughts. It is the internal architecture of our mental content that their technical language is supposed to make explicit. Their analysis is not an analysis of the world per se, but rather of our world constituted understanding of and engagement with what there is, as defined by their ontology. Like almost every Sanskrit philosopher who preceded and succeeded him, Gangesha and the new epistemologists were deeply interested in philosophical issues that we would, without hesitation, identify as belonging to the contemporary philosophy subfields of epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and metaphysics. It is, however, astonishing that he, like almost every Sanskrit philosopher who preceded and succeeded him, did not write anything that we would, without hesitation, identify as belonging to the contemporary subfield of analytic ethics or political philosophy. In fact, some might go so far as to argue, and I'm one of them, that ethics was not considered by classical Indian philosophers to be a subfield of philosophy at all. This does not mean that philosophers who wrote in classical Sanskrit, or not philosophers, this does not mean that Sanskrit intellectuals were not interested in ethical questions or questions about politics. They very much were. They just did not write about ethics and politics in anything like the same way they wrote about philosophy of language, mind, epistemology, and metaphysics. There isn't a single text, I will say, not a single one, written in classical Sanskrit that we would, without hesitation, identify as a work of philosophical ethics, in the same way as we easily identify without hesitation works of the other philosophy subfield, including aesthetics. This reveals something very interesting. It reveals that they thought that ethics ought to be done and pursued in a way very different than the other subfields. And we can talk maybe later about why that is the case. So this view is, of course, controversial, but it's one that I'll stand by. So you guys can argue with me about it if you want, and give me, all I'm looking for is one counterexample. Remember, I said there isn't a single classical Sanskrit text that we would identify without hesitation as being a work of philosophical ethics. And that includes the one that everyone cites as a counterexample, a text called the Bodhicharya Avatara of Shantideva, Bodhisattva's Guide to Life. So, if any of you know an example, let me know, and I'll happily revise my view. Or I'll say it's the exception that proves the rule, one of the two, depending on what text you cite. All right, here we go. So while this is arguably the case for ethics, narrowly construed, I will argue that it's not at all the case for metaethics. My argument is based on a neglected chapter from the third book of Gangesha's Jewel, the book on testimony, one of the four sources of knowledge accepted by him. The stated purpose of this neglected chapter, the chapter on command utterances, is an inquiry into how scriptural injunctions, that is, Vedic utterances expressive of commands, are fundamental for scripturally sanctioned human action, such as the performance of this or that Vedic ritual. We are told more specifically that such utterances are fundamental in that they generate instigating awareness. That is, awareness events that lead ultimately and in principle to action. Yet, it is very clear from Gangesha's discussion that the scope of this chapter extends far beyond scripturally sanctioned human action. In fact, its purpose is to develop and defend a theory of action in general. In this paper, I provide a preliminary interpretation of Gangesha's theory of action and argue more specifically that the philosophical issues most central to it have to do with motivation to the means, and two related issues having to do with the sources of normativity and perhaps surprisingly linguistic force. When the chapter on command utterances is understood in this way, it becomes much easier to appreciate why the issue of what Vedic utterances convey was such an important one for late pre-modern and early modern Sanskrit philosophers. It also forces us to confront the embarrassing fact that it has been almost completely neglected in contemporary scholarship, especially by students of Indian philosophy, who are far too easily scared off by texts or sections of texts that even appear to be about religion, or even worse, Vedic rituals. So my paper begins with a brief introduction to the conceptual vocabulary that Gangesha uses to present his theory of action, and then turns to a preliminary analysis of it. Through this analysis, I introduce the philosophical issues that I believe are at the center of Gangesha's chapter on command utterances, and explain how they inform his account of action. Once these issues are in view, their significance to metaethics will, I trust, be readily apparent. Whether there is any merit to Gangesha's view is something that I hope we can discuss, as I'm not yet sure just what to make of it. All right. So the conceptual vocabulary that Gangesha uses to discuss the philosophy of action was inherited from his Nyaya Vaisheshika predecessors, and in fact was shared by almost all Sanskrit philosophers. So let's have slide 1, please. Perfect. In broad outline, Gangesha argues that instigating awareness generates a desire to act, which then leads to mental effort, which is itself directed toward a particular action, which, among other things, is believed to be the means to a desired end. It is this mental effort that I referred to above as motivation to the means. So imagine if one of your parents or your friend says to you, please close the door, and you then close the door. What kind of account can you provide of what it is that is conveyed to you by the person saying to you, please close the door, right? The person utters the words, please close the door. Something is conveyed to you by those words. And on the basis of what's conveyed to you, in this case, you act. So Gangesha says that what's conveyed to you is a certain kind of awareness event called instigating awareness. Then that leads to a desire to act on your part, which then leads to you being motivated to act, which then leads you to getting up and closing the door. That's the basic problem. We need to figure out the details now and whether we think these details are any good, whether his story is any good, basically. Okay. So it's important to note that for Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophers like Gangesha, awareness, desire, including the desire to act, and mental effort are taken to be properties that belong uniquely to the self. So just a little bit of an aside. In classical Indian philosophy, the words property and property possessor are used quite broadly. So a property is really anything that can be located somewhere. And a property possessor is simply a locus. So we might think of it as the property location model. Let me give you an example. I can say an apple is red, or we can just see a red apple. In that case, we would say the apple is the property possessor. It's a locus, right? And it has the property being red. I could also say the apple is on the table, in which case the table is the locus and the apple is the property. So generally, anything that can be located could be a property, and any locus could be a property possessor. A specific ontology will decide whether apple can actually be a property or not, but it certainly can be located. So we want to think of loci and locatables. So when I say that for Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophers like Gangesha, awareness, desire, including the desire to act and mental effort, are properties that belong uniquely to the self, it means the self is the locus in which these three things, awareness, cognitions, desires, and effort, are located. Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophers really do think these are properties, strictly speaking. Okay, so of these three special properties of the self, only awareness is, strictly speaking, a mental event, in that it alone has mental content. Although neither desire nor mental effort are themselves awareness events, they both can be the contents of one, in that I can be aware of my desires and aware of my mental effort. Furthermore, although neither desire nor mental effort has mental content, both are often described as though they do. In such cases, it's important to keep in mind that their having content or being object directed is entirely dependent upon an awareness event and its content. Debates about the philosophy of action in much of Sanskrit philosophy, therefore, focus on the content of instigating awareness events and how such instigating awareness events motivate, prompt, or push an agent to direct their efforts toward the believed means to a desired end via the intermediary of that agent's desire to act upon the means. So in his account of instigating awareness, Gangesha not only describes and analyzes the content of instigating awareness events, but he also explains how such awareness events were produced and how a desire to act upon the means and the motivation to it are related to these contents. Of particular interest to me, and also of interest to Gangesha, is how the transitions from instigating awareness to a desire to act, and from a desire to act to motivation to the means are to be accounted for. In general, Gangesha's account of these transitions is presented from a third-person standpoint of evaluation. That is, from the standpoint of someone who is interpreting, assessing, and evaluating the action undertaken by an agent. Through his account of these transitions, Gangesha seeks to provide what seem to be both motivating and normative reasons for them. That is, he seeks to provide an account of why instigating awareness is motivationally efficacious, and also why failing to be so motivated by it is, for example, censurable. Before turning to an analysis of these transitions, it's helpful to first consider what Gangesha has to say about instigating awareness and how it's produced. While scriptural commands are taken to be the paradigmatic producers of instigating awareness, any source of knowledge can, in principle, generate it. Let's move to slide 2. Thus, not only can Vedic utterances, such as the paradigmatic, a person desirous of heaven ought to perform the new and full moon sacrifice, lead to instigating awareness, but as Gangesha makes clear, ordinary utterances can too. For example, the utterance, a person desirous of cooked rice ought to cook rice grains, for someone who is hungry for rice. Furthermore, since, according to Gangesha, even pre-linguistic infants can be motivated to the means, as for example, when they suckle at the breasts of their mothers, it's clear that instigating awareness is not simply the result of testimony. In the case of the baby, for example, it results from what is called an inference for oneself. And while Gangesha does not discuss an example of instigating awareness that results from perception, it's clear that perception too can at least contribute to the production of instigating awareness. As for example, when a person ducks to avoid getting hit by a baseball. In each of these cases, a person is motivated to act on the basis of an instigating awareness event. Since testimony is the paradigmatic source for instigating awareness, however, my discussion will focus on it. Let's move to slide 3. As an example, consider the content of the instigating awareness event that is produced when a competent speaker of a language correctly understands a token utterance containing a deontic modal, such as the utterance, a person desirous of rice grains ought to cook rice grains. According to Gangesha, the content of this awareness event is constituted by a number of components that correspond to the semantic values of the 3 complex terms that make up the utterance. Remember, the idea is that when a person hears, or when a competent speaker, for example, has a verbalizable thought, it says a person desirous of rice grains ought to, a person desirous of rice ought to cook rice grains, right? That is the verbalizable content of a thought. And that is supposed to be the content of an instigating awareness event. So we need to analyze the components of that utterance, and that means of that thought, in order to figure out what this instigating awareness is that pushes a person who has this desire to act, right? So we need to focus on the 3 components. The first component is the agent, that is the person who is desirous of rice grains. Another component is the finite verb. In this case, the optative third person singular ought to cook. And the final component is the patient rice grains, right? A person desires of rice, that's the agent, ought to cook, the verb, ought to cook what? Ought to cook rice grains, the patient. Each of these terms is also complex in the sense that each is itself made up of more than one component word. For our purposes, of greatest importance is the semantic value, you might think of it roughly as meaning, of the finite verb, which is itself composed from the semantic values of two component words, the underlying verbal root and the verbal suffix. So we are interested in what? We're interested in the finite verb, which is here, ought to cook, right? That finite verb is said to be made up of two subwords. One subword is the underlying verbal root. We might think of it as cooking, right? To cook. And the other is the verbal ending. So for example, if you take a verbal root like to cook, you can say should cook, ought to cook, is cooking, was cooked, right? The verb can be conjugated in different tenses and moods. So Nyaya philosophers think that the markers of these tenses and moods are also words, and that the underlying root is a word. So the finite verb ought to cook is made up of two parts, a verbal root and a verbal suffix. Now, according to Gangesha, the semantic value of the verbal root is an intermediary activity that leads to a result. Thus, what is conveyed by the underlying root of the finite verb ought to cook is the intermediary activity that leads to the softening of the rice grains, that is, the cooking of the rice. The semantic value of the verbal suffixes, according to Gangesha, is the mental effort that, in relevant cases, the agent in question directs toward the intermediary activity that is expressed by the underlying verbal root. So the finite verb is made up of two parts, the root part and the ending part. And those two parts each have their own meaning. The root part conveys the action that leads to the result, which in this case is cooking, right? The ending part, you might think verbal endings have meaning. Yes, for Nyaya philosophers, they do. And the ending is effort. It conveys effort. All right. So in the sentence, Devadatta is cooking rice grains, for example, the semantic value of the third person singular present indicative ending of the verb is cooking is the effort that Devadatta directs toward the cooking of the rice grains. For Gangesha, a finite verb conveys that the agent in question is directing, has directed, or will direct their effort toward an intermediary activity that leads to a result. It conveys, in other words, an agent's motivation to the means. In discussions of command utterances, however, it is the semantic value of specifically deontic modals, such as optatives, that is usually at issue. According to Gangesha, what is additionally conveyed by the optative suffixes are the following three properties of the intermediary activity that is expressed by the underlying verbal root. Take a second here. So we were talking about the verb to cook. And we know that according to Gangesha, the verb to cook, say in the present tense, is cooking, is made up of two parts. It's made up of the root, which is the cooking part, and it's made up of the present ending, let's just say is, right? So in that case, what the ending conveys is just is. But what about if I have an imperative? Cook, right? Not is cooking, but cook. Then the ending is going to convey something different in the imperative than it would if it were in the present. Does that make sense? So we need to figure out what in addition is conveyed when you have a command versus when you have a present tense utterance, right? Obviously, Devadatta is cooking is different than Devadatta cook, right? So Devadatta part is the same. The root to cook is the same. What's different is in the one case, we have a present tense verb, is cooking. And in another case, we have this imperative verb or optative verb, should cook or cook. So we're trying to figure out what's the difference between is cooking and should cook. I should say that we normally in English don't think of these kinds of things too much. And one of the most important things when you study philosophy from different times and places, and particularly Indian philosophy, is always look in all the wrong places. So when you find something that seems really boring to you or totally crazy, that's exactly what you need to focus on, because the people did it for a reason. If you can figure out why, it gets interesting. So this issue of command utterances and optatives is something that I didn't pay attention to for a long time because I thought it was boring and weird. And when I finally did, I realized that was a big mistake. So I'm passing on that to you. So the issue is, according to Gangesha, what is additionally conveyed by optative suffixes are the following three properties of the intermediary activity that is expressed by the underlying verbal root. These are: one, the property that the activity can be brought about with effort, really with one's own effort. Two, that the property, second, the property that that action is a means to a desired end. And three, the property of not causing greater suffering than the suffering that is invariably connected with producing the desired end. So let's think about just the example, Devadatta should cook, right? So what the should conveys, in addition to the is that the action of cooking is one, a property that can be brought about with Devadatta's effort. That is, that Devadatta can cook. The second is that cooking is a means to a desired end, namely the cooked rice that Devadatta wants to eat. And the third is that the cooking will not cause greater suffering than the suffering that is invariably connected with getting cooked rice. So if satisfying your desire is not worth the effort of cooking, you won't act, right? So it doesn't have that property. It has that property too, of not causing greater suffering than the suffering that is invariably connected with producing the desired end. Okay, thus, according to Gangesha, what is conveyed by the utterance, a person desirous of rice ought to cook rice grains, is, from our third person standpoint, that a person who currently desires cooked rice will direct their effort toward the intermediary activity of cooking, which is an action that that person judges can be brought about through her own effort, that is a means to her desired end, and that does not lead to greater suffering. In other words, what is conveyed is that for some action phi, an agent believes that phi is a means to her currently desired end, that it can be brought about by her own effort, and, to put it simply, that it's worth it. Notice that the complex content of this agent's awareness can be described by three that clauses, each of which predicates a property of the action phi. Each of these that clauses also exhibits what has been called a word to world or mind to world direction of fit, in the sense that each is supposed to fit the way the world is. In such awareness events, the content is grasped as fitting or being patterned after the world. Just think of the first one, that the action can be brought about through her own effort, that the action is a means to a desired end, that it does not lead to greater suffering. Notice too that the agent's own awareness that phi in fact has any of these properties is fallible, in the sense that our agent could be mistaken about phi possessing any one of them. What Gangesha needs to explain is how instigating awareness, with its word to world direction of fit, leads to a desire to phi, with its world to word direction of fit. I missed a sentence in my talk. So we said that awareness events, right, that actually capture these three properties have world to word direction of fit, right? Desires and commands are different. So desires and commands have word-to-word direction of fit, in the sense that the content of such awareness events is grasped as a pattern that the world is supposed to fit or conform to. Think of the difference between this action will lead me to my desired end, or this action leads to my desired end, versus I want rice, right? I want cooked rice. The action leading to that desired end is a kind of fact. The world is such that it already has that fact built into it for neo-philosophers. Unlike your desire that there be cooked rice, right? The world isn't yet like that. The world does not yet have the cooked rice in that sense. Does that make sense a little bit? The difference between these word to world and world to word direction of fit. There is, however, a feature of instigating awareness that complicates this picture somewhat. According to Gangesha, there are two categories of desired ends, those that are primary and those that are secondary. He claims further that pleasure and the absence of suffering are our only primary ends. The means to our primary ends can also be desired, but as Gangesha says, they are secondary ends in the sense that our desire for them is entirely dependent upon our desire for the primary end to which they are the means. Unlike our primary end, these secondary ends are always actions. So I have a desire for cooked rice, right? I may have a desire to cook. They're different things, right? Desire for cooked rice is a desire for an end. Desire to cook is a desire for the means. Desire for cooked rice is the primary end, cooked rice. Desire for cooking is a secondary end. According to Gangesha, desire for a primary end is generated simply by our awareness of it, in the sense that it is our awareness of pleasure or the absence of suffering that produces our desire for it. Our awareness that some action phi is a means to such a desired end is based on what we take to be a source of knowledge. Since the means to such a desired end is an action, our desire for a secondary end just is a desire for the means, which, it is important to note, is not the same as a desire to act upon the means. According to Gangesha, a desire for phi is not the same as a desire to phi. Gangesha describes a desire to phi as an inner call to action that we are aware we can bring about through our own effort. He sometimes says that this desire to phi can be paraphrased by the expression, I am prompted to make phi happen through my own effort. And he suggests further that its semantic range includes a variety of pro-attitudes, including wants, shoulds, and oughts. The only resource that Gangesha has to explain the force of these wants, shoulds, and oughts is, interestingly, the content of instigating awareness. In contrast to the desire to phi, a desire for phi is merely and simply a desire that phi happen. It is a desire that cooking take place and not the desire to cook. So this distinction between desire to phi and a desire for phi is important. So a desire to phi is a desire you have to cook. A desire for phi is just your desire that cooking happen. Right? Gangesha's view that the agent's awareness that phi is the means to a currently desired end is equivalent to a desire for phi, which, as I mentioned above, is a desire for a secondary end or action that I know to be a means to my primary end. This somewhat complicates my earlier account of instigating awareness. It does so by introducing a desire for as a component of the content of instigating awareness, a component which I suggested above may have a different direction of fit than the component that it is supposed to be a replacement for, that is, the means to a desired end. Regardless of this complication, however, the relevant issue is how instigating awareness leads to a desire to phi, and what role, if any, a desire for the end to which phi is known to be the means, that is, the desire for phi, plays in this process. Let's go to slide 4. Thank you. To understand how Gangesha might address this issue, it's necessary to briefly reconsider the 3 properties that are predicated of phi in genuinely instigating awareness events. The property that phi is a means to a desired end, which is property 2 on the slide, may be helpfully thought of as being made up of 2 subcomponents. A desired end, right? That is the end that an agent has a desire for, and an awareness that phi is a means to it. One of Gangesha's opponents argues that an awareness of these 2 subcomponents is sufficient to account for a desire to act upon the means, that is, to account for a desire to phi. The opponent's view is that a desire for some end plus the belief that phi is a means to that end is sufficient to generate a desire to phi. So for example, suppose you have a desire for cooked rice, and you know that cooking is the means to getting cooked rice. The opponent says that's all you need to generate this desire that you actually cook. This principle is the opponent's version of the instrumental or means end norm. It is clear, however, that Gangesha rejects this and argues that there are in fact 2 further properties that an agent must be aware that phi has before a desire to phi can be generated. These 2 properties are that phi can be brought about by the agent, which is property 1 on the slide. I'll refer to this as the capability condition, and that phi does not lead to even greater suffering, which is property 3 on the slide. I'll refer to this as the relative value condition. Without either the capability or relative value conditions being satisfied, Gangesha argues that the awareness that phi is the means to a desired end will not lead to a desire to phi. In his view, while the awareness that phi is the means to a desired end is equivalent to having a desire for phi, it does not lead to a desire to phi. That is, it does not lead to a desire to act upon the means. Let's substitute our cooking example there, right? Gangesha argues that the awareness that cooking is a means to a desired end will not lead to a desire to cook. In his view, while the awareness that cooking is the means to a desired end is equivalent to having a desire that cooking happen, that's the desire for phi, it does not lead to a desire to cook, right? If you have a desire for cooked rice and you know that cooking is a means to getting cooked rice, Gangesha says all that means is that you have a desire that someone cook, right? That cooking happen. It doesn't mean that you have a desire to cook. And so it won't mean that you won't be pushed to cook. You might be pushed to call for takeout, right? But you won't be pushed to cook. So a desire for phi, for cooking, that cooking take place is different than the desire that you cook. So simply being aware that cooking is a means to a desired end and having a desire for that end will not push you to cook. So he thinks that in order to go from having a desire that cooking happen to the desire that you cook, you need to have these 2 other things, these 2 other properties. You need to know that you can actually cook. That is, if you can't cook or you're dangerous in the kitchen, then you might have a desire that cooking take place, but you would not have a desire to cook yourself. Or the relative value condition. If cooking is such a nightmare that you'd rather starve, right, then you're not going to have a desire to cook. So Gangesha thinks that in addition to being aware that some action is a means to a desired end that you actually seek, you need to satisfy the capability condition and the relative value condition. Otherwise, you won't act. Okay. So without either the capability or relative value conditions being satisfied, Gangesha argues that the awareness that phi is the means to a desired end will not lead to a desire to phi, right? In his view, while the awareness that phi is the means to a currently desired end is equivalent to having a desire for phi, it does not lead to a desire to phi. That is, it does not lead to a desire to act upon the means. According to Gangesha, there is something else about the content of an instigating awareness event that moves one's mind from an awareness that phi has such and such properties to a desire to phi. That is, from an awareness that has a world to word direction of fit to one that has a world to word direction of fit. I'd like to suggest that in order for Gangesha to account for this, Gangesha appeals to a broadly dispositional theory of what it means for an agent to have a desire for phi. According to this theory, phi is desirable for some agent if and only if that agent would be disposed to phi under certain circumstances, which for Gangesha are specified by the capability and relative value conditions. Given the satisfaction of the capability and relative value conditions, Gangesha argues that a desire for phi disposes one to have a desire to phi, which then motivates her to phi. The dispositional interpretation of a desire for thus seems to provide at least a motivating reason for an agent to have a desire to phi. It does not, however, seem to account for the supposed normative force that Gangesha also takes this transition to have, since it does not seem to be able to account for his view that not forming a desire to phi in such circumstances is censurable or in some sense blameworthy. Acting contrary to a disposition, for example, does not seem to be an act that violates a rational or relatively similar normative requirement. Let's take our cooking example again. You have a desire for cooked rice. You are aware that cooking is a means to that desired end. Gangesha says that's not sufficient to push you to cook. All it does is give you a desire that cooking take place by someone somewhere. He says, though, that when you have the content of your awareness, there are two other features that an optative conveys, right? If it's, suppose you understand, I ought to cook, someone desires of rice grains ought to cook rice grains, right? So the other, you are aware that the cooking has these three properties, that it's a means to a desired end, that it's something that can be brought about by your own effort, and that it's worth it. Suppose even after being aware of that, you don't cook. Gangesha says it's possible to censure you in some way. Just because you don't, you're in trouble for not cooking. You're blameworthy. The question is, where does the normative force of that come from? So, as I understand Gangesha, however, there's something else about this dispositional account of a desire for that is supposed to account for what he sees as the normative nature of this transition, the right and wrongness of it. My suggestion that for Gangesha, in disposing an agent to phi, when the capability and relative value conditions are satisfied, a desire for phi is supposed to do more than just provide a motivating reason for her desire to phi. It seems to do so by making these conditions salient to her in a way they would not be if she did not have this desire. Her desire to phi is therefore an attitude that is sensitive to a judgment that the capability and relative value conditions have been satisfied. It is her desire for phi, however, that accounts for why the satisfaction of the capability and relative value conditions strike her as salient, and therefore count for her as considerations in favor of her forming a desire to phi. If we can take these considerations in favor of as reasons for her to have a desire to phi, then it seems as though we have found at least two rational requirements for her desire to phi, in the sense that were she to be unresponsive to them, we could claim that she is irrational. Slide number 5, please. Sorry, look at the time. From Gangesha's third-person standpoint of evaluation, then, a person who forms a desire to phi on the basis of a genuinely instigating awareness does so for motivating and normative reasons, which can both be explained by her desire for phi. A desire for phi can be motivationally efficacious and also make one count as having acted for a reason. On my interpretation, then, Gangesha's broadly dispositional account of a desire for accounts for both motivating and normative reasons that an agent has to form a desire to phi. If this is even approximately an adequate account of how the transition between instigating awareness and a desire to phi is to be explained, what remains is to explain how, according to Gangesha, this desire to phi generates a motivation to phi. Slide number 6, please. The transition from a desire to phi, that is having a desire to act upon the means, to being motivated to phi, that is having motivation to the means, is importantly different from the transition from instigating awareness to a desire to phi. Since the transition from a desire to act to motivation is one between awareness events that both have world-to-word directions of fit. In both these awareness events, the primary constituent of content is not an action phi, but either a desire, as in the case of a desire to act, or effort, as in the case of motivation to the means. In my view, it's Gangesha's implicit commitment to a motivational theory of desire for awareness events in which desire is the primary constituent of content that accounts for this transition. This idea of primary constituent of content might not be so clear. Think of instigating awareness, right? That where the central piece was, you are aware that some action is a means to an end that you desire, right? What is the most relevant feature? What is the main star of the content of that awareness? It's that something is a means to a desired end, right? So the content is an action. It's the means. But when I have a desire, when I have a cooking desire, right? The primary feature of that awareness, when I'm aware of a desire to cook, right? That desire is the most important thing. That's the star of that awareness event. So when the idea is that when desire is the primary constituent of content, that's different than when it is just a secondary constituent of content. So according to many motivational accounts, if we could have slide 7, please. Thank you. According to many motivational accounts, to desire that P just is to be motivated toward making it the case that P. Since for Gangesha, desire and motivation are different kinds of things, his version of the motivational account has to be causal, in the sense that an awareness event which has a desire towards making it the case that P as its primary constituent causes an awareness event which has motivation toward making it the case that P. On such a view, being motivated to phi is generated simply by our awareness of having a desire to phi. What motivates one to the means on this view just is the desire to act upon the means. In this sense, one cannot be motivated to the means without desire. All right, conclusion. Could we have slide 8, please? So in this paper, I provide a very preliminary interpretation of Gangesha's theory of action, and have argued that it is based on two theories of desire: a dispositional theory of a desire for the means, and a motivational theory of a desire to act upon the means. On my interpretation of Gangesha's view, when desire is a secondary constituent of the content of an awareness event, a qualifier in his words, as it is an instigating awareness, right, where the primary constituent is the action phi, it is dispositional. While when it is the primary constituent of content, as it is in a desire to phi, it is motivational. I argued further that through his dispositional interpretation of a desire for, Gangesha tries to account for both motivating and normative reasons. When Gangesha's chapter on command utterances is understood in terms of the transitions discussed in this paper, it becomes apparent that it is about issues of philosophical significance, both for the history of Sanskrit philosophy and for the history of philosophy more broadly. Some of these issues have to do with the philosophy of action, as is evident from Gangesha's discussion of motivation to the means and his account of motivating and normative reasons for action. Furthermore, when it is noticed that Gangesha's account of instigating awareness is also the basis for his analysis of the semantics and pragmatics of indicatives, optatives, and imperatives, it becomes apparent that his chapter on command utterances also touches, at least in part, on issues of linguistic force. This range of topics is, of course, not only directly relevant to metaethics, the philosophy of action, and the philosophy of language, but it also touches on issues in moral psychology, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. If there was ever any doubt before, I hope that it is now at least clear that discussions of command utterances in Indian philosophy are not just about what Vedic utterances convey. What remains for us to discover if anything, we can learn from Gangesha's metaethics. Gangesha's jewel is a remarkable window onto at least 500 years of philosophical history in India. And yet it is a text that we have only just begun to learn how to see through and think with. This essay has, in a very preliminary way, attempted to contribute to this effort by trying to show why a topic that has seemed to be so uninteresting, unimportant, and irrelevant to so many ought not to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up to see if any of the panelists have any questions first. And in the meantime, attendees should feel free to type in a question in the Q&A function. Hannah, did you have a hand up?
I did. Thank you so much for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. I was curious, I'm not sure if this idea relates enough, but do these ideas have any relation to the question of an agent's freedom, as we read, for example, in this concept of the psychological experience of freedom being enough to experience or accept something, being free? For example, the Mimamsa school. Is there any conception of freedom or free will on the agent's part, given these concepts of instigating awareness or perhaps being implied in the means to motivation and the related steps and transitions? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, it's very good. So as you may know from the reading, the topic of free will is not directly identified as a topic, but clearly it's an issue, right? We see it here. So remember, instigating awareness on my story has these three components, right? The first component is that there is some action phi that's a means to a desired end. And then there are these two conditions that have to be satisfied, right? The capability condition and the relative value condition. So it's if an agent judges that those two conditions are satisfied, that she is then pushed to act. So she won't be pushed to act unless she judges that those conditions have been satisfied. And so in a way, it's not that she's forced. She, in a way, brings it upon herself once she's determined that these two conditions are satisfied. So we could find a way in that idea of judgment and not being forced to make that judgment in a sense. A beginning of a bit of freedom, right? Free will. We'd have to really work this out, we'd have to ask ourselves very simple questions like, which are not easy to answer, right? What is will, right? What constitutes a will being free versus just being influenced or shaped? And so we have to get into the weeds there a little bit. But I think if we did, we'd find that this account has to allow, they do think it allows for it.
Thank you. Any other panelist questions here? Yes, Jagosi.
Hi, also thank you
Hi.
for your talk. I really enjoyed it as well. I was wondering, and maybe this just went over my head, but is there anything more to say sort of on the model, that basic overview of philosophy of action in about transition 3 from motivation to the means and then to action? If there's some sort of something important there that like maybe I missed, but like what sort of like that final step is that then pushes sort of from certain judgments and considerations to actual action?
Yeah, I mean, no, you didn't, nothing went over your head. You understood it exactly right and better than actually I presented it, right? Because on the story I have, there's this motivation to the means, right? And then all of a sudden there's action. And you notice there's an arrow there, but I didn't talk much about it, right? So there is a gap. You can be motivated to act and then maybe not yet act. For example, you could be motivated to act and I don't know, you drop dead of a stroke or something, right? So there are other kinds of conditions that are necessary, but they don't really think those are relevant to whether you should be censured or not. So it's not your fault in that sense after that, right? It's just a freak of nature or something. So there's a causal story then about how you go from being, what exactly is involved from being motivated to physically moving, right? Or to mentally moving or verbally moving. But they're simply interested in everything up to that point, because what comes after that doesn't seem relevant for their issue of whether you should be censured or not for not responding to a command. That would be considered enough to respond to the command. Succeeding in your action isn't necessary, right? Right. We can imagine that the success of an action might be evaluated differently than the push, the genuine push that you have to try to act. Did that help, or did that make it worse? No. Okay, good.
I guess one might wonder relatedly where weakness of will comes into the picture here. I mean, I can, I'm going to say I can imagine, but these are just straightforward memories from my everyday life. You know, I have a desire for some rice, I want rice. I know that cooking rice is a means to attaining that, but I find I have no motivation whatsoever to actually get up and cook rice. Now, throughout the talk, and especially when the slide was up with transition 1, I was thinking, okay, so the view here is that I am now up for some blame or censure, because something got messed up in the process that's supposed to happen. But then I was thinking he had that way out, that it has to also not lead to greater suffering.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is it okay for me to have a weak will because it just hurts me a lot to do stuff? So I don't, you know, I have no discipline. So it's actually really painful to make me do anything. So what's the story there? Is weakness, is this kind of familiar weakness of will something that's bad, normatively speaking?
Yeah, let's think about that. Let's take a sentence like, so there's certain kinds of rituals that are obligatory. Everyone is obligated, well, not everyone, but in this world, you know, in this world, we're talking about men of a certain class are obligated to do these rituals, all right? So it's obligatory for them. Now, suppose we have someone who's a little like Yuval, right? You know, not quite sure about it. So this person has a desire to perform the obligatory rituals, right? Because it's a means to their desired end. In this case, if you don't perform the obligatory rituals, you're going to get a demerit. You're going to lose points. So your motivation is to preserve your points. So that's your desired end. So doing the ritual is a means to a desired end. You're aware of that, right? You also satisfy the capability condition. You're capable of doing it. So you would think the first, that's all good. Now, what about this relative value condition? Could I explain the person's weakness of will in terms of me saying the way I explain that is that for some reason that person thinks that is trying to determine whether or not that relative value condition is satisfied or not, right? Is it better to do it or not do it? Better to do it or not do it? So we could explain weakness of will in this case as an inability to come to a judgment about whether the relative value condition is satisfied. Now, psychologically, it doesn't appear that way to the person, right? The person who's actually sitting there going, all right, should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I? They're not saying, well, I need to deliberate about the relative value condition. Am I satisfying it, right? This is not the person reporting what's going on in her mind. This is how we as a theorist would explain not what's going on in the person, but how we would provide an account of the person not acting. So I think actually, Yuval, that these weakness of will cases are about failure to come to a judgment regarding whether either of these conditions has been satisfied. Now, you ask the next question. If it's an obligatory ritual and Yuval hasn't judged that the relative value condition has been satisfied and doesn't act, is he blameworthy? And the answer is yes. Why? Because you've not correctly judged that the relative value condition is in fact satisfied in this case. You have doubt about whether it's satisfied, when in fact it is satisfied. Right, yeah, so go ahead.
It strikes me as really important and interesting so the wrongness in what happened with me in that case actually stems from a mistaken judgment.
Yeah.
And so that it's a sort of I don't know how to call it exactly, but it's a sort of a intellectualization of moral wrongness in this case that we're familiar with from other kinds of theories. Yeah. But it's really interesting to see it in this context. What do you think of it? Is there another take within related traditions on which it's sort of intellectualizing these wrongs is shunned?
Oh, yes. So, one thing about the Indian philosophical world is that it went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And there was a lot of money put into it. So there are a lot of full-time professional nerds thinking about this stuff for generations and generations and generations. And you know how philosophers are, they love having distinctions. So we have pretty much a full spectrum of views. So we have a group who thinks that really the wrongness isn't about any kind of deliberation or judgment. It's simply like an automatic thing that happens to you. And another group who think that they're more Kantian, right? That there's a kind of obligation that you have, and that the obligation then is the source of the normativity. So there's a whole spectrum of views on. I don't know if did that speak to what you're asking? There's really the full range of views you can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to follow up and ask what the Sanskrit for nerd was, but I think instead, probably more important, Nikki had a question as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming to speak here, Professor.
My pleasure.
I think I was curious about, so we just learned a lot about Buddhism as well, and they do originate from the same place and with some of the same ideas. In Buddhism, the idea of desire is so interesting because it is so shunned in a lot of ways, I think. And I was wondering if you could speak to any connections, perhaps with the rationale of why desire isn't necessarily a bad thing in certain Indian philosophy as well. Like, for example, for Gangesha, while it is maybe worse in Buddhism and other schools.
Okay. So, as we know, there's really no such thing as Buddhism or a Buddhist philosophy, right? There's lots of Buddhisms and lots of Buddhist philosophers. But Buddhist philosophers, for example, a very famous one named Vasubandhu, who wrote a text called The Treasury of Metaphysics, the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya, has in one chapter, chapter 4, a theory of action. He's a philosopher. He's got to explain when, when your mother tells you to close the door, you close the door. What's the deal? Why do you do it, right? So desire isn't always bad for Buddhist philosophers, right? If you're explaining a theory of action, you're going to have some role that desire is going to play. So the kind of desire that is bad is, it's not really what we call a desire. Think of it as a kind of obsession, a kind of quiet obsession that you don't realize is an obsession on your part. It's kind of a perverse desire. And that's often captured by this personalistic fallacy, right? The fallacy that there is some kind of enduring self or person, right? On the basis of which for which you have some special concern. So there's an enduring self or person. And if you think there is an enduring self or person, then you have special concern for that person. And that special concern is a kind of perverse desire that then binds you to the cycle of life and death. So that kind of desire is bad. But Buddhists like good food too, right? They could ask their, even though they were, even if they were monks, they might have tastes and likes and dislikes. So desires aren't necessarily bad. And certainly in explaining action, it's not necessarily bad.
Yes, Naiti.
I had a question with regards to so in one of the podcasts that thank you for your talk. It was great. In the podcast that you had us listen to, they talked about conception-free perception versus conception-loaded perception. So I was wondering how conception-free perception would play into this theory of action, and if it does at all, and if you could conceptualize, I guess, lots of concepts, but if there is a theory of action with conception-free perception.
Very good. So Nyaya philosophers, just like Mimamsa philosophers that Hannah mentioned, think that there are two types of perception. Think there's non-conceptual perception and conceptualized forms of perception. Buddhist philosophers in general think that perception is only non-conceptualized. They think that because any form of conceptualization, they think of as a distortion. And they don't want to call something distorted perception and therefore privilege it as a knowing event. Nyaya philosophers and Mimamsa philosophers, don't worry, I'm getting your question. Nyaya philosophers and Mimamsa philosophers think that conceptualization isn't distorting, it just highlights something. It highlights something that's already there. But they think that non-conceptualized perception is not really something that's accessible to us, right? It's not like anything to non-conceptually perceive. So if we're going to provide a theory of action, it's really always about conceptualized perception. So that conceptualized perception has to, it's conceptualized. It has to follow from something non-conceptualized, but that isn't really that relevant. To give you an example, in sense perception, the red apple we talked about, the content of a non-conceptual awareness event of looking at red apple would have three disconnected bits. It would have apple, it would have being red, and it would have the relation possessing a color. Then conceptualized perception would present apple is red to you. The non-conceptual would just be the bits.
To follow up on that,
yeah.
Could you have a partial conception? So and maybe I'm misunderstanding this, and please clarify if I am, but say I have I know apple and I recognize apple, but I don't recognize red and I don't have a concept of red. So, or perhaps it would be easier to imagine it the other way, but would you be able to then have a theory of action if you had partial conception?
Well, remember, the theory of action is one that's retrospective. It's something that we use to explain what we see someone as having done. So it's not meant to be predictive, right? I can't look into your head and say, this is what Naiti's going to do necessarily, right? So yeah, of course, that when you non-conceptually perceive something, right? You can conceptualize it in lots of ways. You can misconceptualize it, right? So you could look at a red apple and you could say, you could be aware of it as a red apple. You could see it as a red apple. You could see it as food. You could see it as something that may help slake your thirst. You could see it as a toy you can throw to somebody. You could see it as a weapon you can use to bonk somebody on the head, right? So you can conceptualize it in many, many ways, some of which would be considered true and some which might be errors. Yeah. So it's the conceptualized apple that would be the basis for your action, right? Whether eating or throwing or, you know, fleeing from if you have a horrible apple allergy or something like that.
I think we have time for one more question, and I want to go to an audience question for that.
And I don't mind staying a little bit longer if you want me to. That's fine too. There's more
Okay,
questions.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So this question is, hi, Professor, from an anonymous attendee. Hi, Professor. Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak to how some Buddhist philosophy denies the existence of personal identity and how this may differ from Gangesha's philosophy as you presented today. I suppose
I
you
can
could take
try.
it as a sort of invitation to speak to about sort of the role of the substantial self in this theory of
Right.
action.
Right. So, as you know, for Gangesha, right, there is a persisting self. And the self is the locus where all the action happens in the self. The self is the locus where cognition is. If I say to you, you have a thought, I say to you, where's your thought? Where's it located? You might say in my head, well, or in your brain. Gangesha says, well, the thought is located in yourself. And also desire is located in yourself, and effort is located in yourself. So he thinks that you have to have a persisting self to explain how action works. If you're a Buddhist, and most of the Buddhists that we're talking about were momentarists, so they didn't think there was any kind of persisting entity, right? So how would a Buddhist explain action? You have Parimal now, you have Parimal now, you have Parimal, 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 right? It's just, they're all radically disconnected momentary things. How would you explain action? So a Nyaya philosopher like Gangesha thinks that a persisting entity is necessary for explaining action and for explaining other things. Like, how come if Parimal studies for a test, Parimal is going to get a good grade, and if Parimal doesn't study for a test, Parimal's not going to get a good grade. It's not like if Parimal studies for a test, Hannah's going to get the good grade necessarily, right? Gangesha thinks the only way you can explain that is if there's a persisting self called Parimal that is actually the source of one's identity. Buddhists think that all notions of personal identity are basically conceptual constructions. So they think of, there's the illusion that there's a person Parimal. There's just Parimal, 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 and we construct a whole Parimal on the basis of conceptual construction. That was very fast and very crude. I don't know if that got to what the person was asking or not. This is a huge topic.
Well, the person was anonymous, so I can't ask directly.
Oh, okay.
Please
Sorry.
do follow up in the Q&A function, whoever that was, if you're still here. I wonder, though, can I follow up just a little bit? Is there an analog, kind of just going off of Naiti's kind of line of comparing some of the stuff we've learned about the philosophy of perception to this philosophy of action in Indian philosophy? Is there a similar kind of, I don't know, objection might be too strong, but maybe it's not. Is there a similar sort of objection against the Buddhist no-self view on the basis of sort of the theoretical need for a persisting self in perception? That is,
oh yeah.
Hey, why did I react this way when me from 2 seconds ago saw the tiger? I mean, I'm a brand new.
Yes. I mean, look, you can imagine that they're going to use every trick in the book, if you will, to argue against each other. So, right, because remember, the Buddhists have to be able to explain how this very counterintuitive view that there are no persisting entities can nevertheless be a basis for explaining things that we want explained, such as, it looks like I'm seeing the same people now as I did 10 minutes ago, right? Or Parimal's the one who reaps the benefits and pays the price of his actions, not somebody else, right? So they have to then use what they believe is the case, no persisting entities, as a way of trying to explain those views. The Nyaya philosophers take their common sense view and push back. In general, the one way to think about it is this way. Nyaya philosophers start with common sense and then get you to a very weird place. Buddhist philosophers start at a very weird place and try to get you to common sense. So in the dialectic, Nyaya philosophers are always marshaling their common sense against the Buddhist weird starting point. And when Buddhist philosophers argue, the first thing they try to do is take all your common sense ideas off the table. So you're kind of desperate, right? They get rid of all your common sense ideas and you're like, oh my God, I don't know what to think. And they say, oh, I got this thing for you. It's called momentariness. Are you open to it now? And you're like, well, I got nothing else. I might as well consider it. So you get this kind of very interesting difference in starting points. And Mimamsa is more on the Nyaya side. They start with common sense and they get you to weird places. Buddhism starts with weird place and tries to get you to common sense. At least that's how I see it.
That's probably one of the most helpful things I've heard or read this whole year on understanding this dynamic between the 6 text traditions that they call orthodox, and in relation to the Buddhist schools. So I very much appreciate that insight. That makes sense of a lot.
Is there something could I say something about the 6 text traditions? So I'm going to make a claim that most people don't like, but I actually think that one of the best things we can do, and it's very hard for us to do because all the material we have on Indian philosophy starts with 6 traditions and orthodox and unorthodox. I think one of the most important things we can do is never think about the history of philosophy in India in terms of 6 traditions, in terms of 6 schools, and in terms of orthodox and heterodox. So much so, I think actually thinking about that way is dangerous. And it distorts the history, and it's also philosophically kind of bankrupt. So the idea of the 6 systems is a relatively modern innovation. I think we can pretty much trace it, I think, to Colebrook, which is post-colonial, which is right around in colonial times. There is no traditional text that has the so-called these 6 systems. I think the early one I could find was like 16th century or 16th century. I can't remember right now. So that idea of the 6 systems and the idea of, look what it does. It says orthodox and says that Buddhism is different, right? You cannot imagine the history of philosophy in India without Buddhism. You cannot imagine Buddhist philosophy without the non-Buddhist traditions. That's point one. So the idea of separating them in any way is just intellectually impossible to provide a good story for. The second problem is that those 6 systems come in 3 pairs, right? There's usually Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga. Those 3 pairs are kind of a joke. They're totally different kinds of pairs. There's no good rhyme or reason for grouping them that way. I mean, well, there's not the same rhyme or reason for grouping them that way. So another reason why the 6 systems is problematic. A final reason it's problematic is they're not all equally important. If you look at what the center of philosophical activity was, say until the 11th century, you're going to get Nyaya, Mimamsa, and Buddhism, and a little bit of Jainism. After that, you're going to get Vedanta and Nyaya and Mimamsa and grammar. So grammar is not mentioned there at all. And just one last thing is we tend to, thinking of it in terms of systems, gives us the idea that these people agreed with each other. Like, oh, Nyaya philosophers say this. I don't know how well you know your philosophy professors, but do any of them agree with each other? Let alone over centuries? They were all individuals, you know? So I think that we are all desperate, and for good reasons, to have a big picture, something to grasp onto, to say, okay, I need to, Indian philosophy, it's insane. I need something to hang my hat on. And there's this really nice 6 systems, orthodox, so we use it, which is, I understand. But I actually think that we need to be very, very careful. And so much so I think we shouldn't use it. And it's very, very hard to get there because that's all the resources we have, right? So sorry, Yuval, I took that as an opportunity to get on my high horse about the 6 systems. Bad.
Please don't be sorry. We really appreciate that. And as you said at the beginning, I think before the audience came, perhaps this is one reason to lament the fact that there's no kind of definitive introductory text here. And so we look forward to yours coming out in a couple of years, maybe.
One of you guys has to write it. not me.
That would be fantastic. I really want to thank you for today. It was really clarifying, and you've really put a nice cap on a lot of discussion and reading that we've done in preparation. So thank you very much for this. Thank you all for attending if you're in the audience. And as always, I can thank my students over and over again because I see them every week.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
No, I'd like to thank you all too. I really appreciate all the effort you put in. It's very clear that you put in a lot of effort and the questions you had. And I should say, if you have questions afterward, feel free to send me an email message and I'll write back, or we can Zoom if you want to talk about it more. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So it's an open invitation.
Awesome. Thank you. We will definitely take
Sure.
you up on it. Have a
Please
great evening, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.